Slow Food is an international grassroots movement. We are present in over 150 countries. Italy is our global headquarters. The Slow Food movement was started in Italy about 30 years ago, and it's all about good, clean, and fair food for all. We have a robust and awesome network of school garden educators, many of whom follow the Slow Food School Garden curriculum. It's in 3 modules, good, clean, and fair, and are really excited about getting kids in the garden and really just getting anyone in the garden and promoting biodiversity in your garden or a school garden or on farms. So encouraging folks to get excited about growing and then get excited about growing different varieties and interesting varieties and essentially boosting biodiversity wherever and however we can. So Slow Food USA is running the Plant a Seed campaign this year for the 4th year. That is a campaign aimed at biodiversity in school gardens. So what we do is we make kits available to the general public, and every time you buy a kit, we send a free one to a school garden. Our school garden educators are working really hard and really creatively at the moment to figure out how to get those seeds into school gardens without the kids there and without being at school teaching. So a big thanks to them and a lot of love to them for their hard work and being so creative about how to be a school garden educator on the internet. So if you want to grab a Plant a Seed kit, once you get your soil all set up for your garden, you can go on to the Slow Food USA website and use the code SlowFoodLive for free shipping. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alison, who is very, very well versed and very well educated in soil science. I will let her tell you more about herself. Alison is coming to us from New Hampshire. She is part of Slow Food Seacoast over there. And I think we would have met in March had we been able to have that event. So I'm glad we get to be here together this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. Alison, thank you so much for your time today. We're really happy to have you. I'm going to let you tell everybody a little more about yourself, and then we have a video from Alison outside on the soil showing us the things she knows and wants to share with us today. So thanks so much for being with us today, Alison. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. So glad that you could log on today to learn about soil. You're going to find out it's my favorite part of the earth. And I live in Barrington, New Hampshire, which is just maybe 20 miles from the seacoast from Portsmouth. And I saw Barb's on our video today. Hello, Barb. How are you? So I went to school at the University of New Hampshire, and I studied soil science and natural resources. And I just thought soil was just really, really fascinating. I spent 20 years working as a research scientist in a forest ecology lab there. I've always been a gardener. I love plants. I love growing plants. And so when Slow Food USA put out a call for people to do a Slow Food Live, I was like, ooh, I'm going to do it on soil. So anyway, I'm going to show, Giselle's going to show the video. And then we're just going to, if you have any questions, I will try to answer them. Soils are really different depending on where you live. So I'll do the best I can, but I do mention some different resources that you can tap into locally that can help you get your garden going for the spring. We are, what you said, Giselle, we're trying to get our seeds distributed out to people as well. And so it's been a challenge this year to try to, everybody wants to grow a garden, but we can't give them anything that we want to. So anyway, we have a couple of seed projects going on, and we also do an heirloom garden project here in the Seacoast area. And so we're trying to keep everything going. Luckily, we do not have to socially distance from plants, and that makes me happy. So that's probably enough of an introduction. Giselle, if you want to go ahead, and we'll run the video, and I hope that it's something that will be useful to you.
Hello everyone. I'm really excited to be doing this video for you as part of Slow Food Live. And my name is Allison, and I live in New Hampshire, and we are a Zone 5. So if you look around, you can see that not much is happening here yet this spring. It's about the middle of April. So we do have some daffodils starting to bloom, and it won't be long before the forsythia comes out. But we tend to be about 6 weeks behind the West Coast and about 2 weeks behind the sort of New York, Connecticut area. So for us, it's the perfect time to really begin thinking about planting your garden. And today I wanted to tell you a little bit about my favorite part of the earth, the soil. I studied soils when I was in college, and I found it just so interesting and such a wonderful connection between our earth and geology and then the living biosphere where all the plants grow. So I wanted to show you some cool things, some of my favorite things about soil. So most people, when they think about planting a garden, they really focus on, what do I want to grow? What kind of plants do I want to have? And visions of cucumbers and squash come into your mind. And so you run out and you get your seeds and you start studying all about what kind of light does this plant need and how long is it going to take before it's going to be ready. And I'd like to argue with you that the first thing that you need to do is not to think about the seeds or the plants that you're going to grow, but to think about whether or not you have properly prepared your garden soil so that the plants you do plant will thrive. So I'm here in my garden, and I don't know if you can see, but my garlic is just now starting to come up. And the first myth that I want to share about soil is that there's a big difference between soil and dirt. So dirt, that's this stuff here on the bottom of your shoe that gets your kitchen floor all dirty. Soil is something completely different. It's a complete living ecosystem, and it has so many wonderful things about it. I like to compare soil to the ocean. When we think of the ocean, we think of the surface of the ocean. It's blue. We might see a bird swooping down. We might catch a fish, and we see a few things about, or a few clues about how the ocean ecosystem works. But the truth is that the ocean is teeming with life, and the amount of interactions and activities that go on under the ocean surface are enormous. And I like to think of soil in that same way. I have a favorite poster that I keep in my office that shows a cutaway from below the soil. So this is a close-up of that poster, and I just really love this because it shows the detail and a nice illustration of all the different bugs and critters and worms that live beneath the soil and how they use the soil for their homes, and also all the roots that grow down there. You can see all the pebbles and all the other mineral parts that are in there. There's a kind of a hint on the top part there of how there's darker material, showing that there's more organic matter at the top and how it lightens up as you go down the soil profile. So the soil ecosystem is very much alive, and it is one of the most important parts of your garden. So you may be asking, all right, if there is so much more below the soil surface, what exactly is that? So looking at this diagram here, you can see that soil is made up of 25% air and 25% water. And the water and air are located in all of the pore spaces in between the particles of soil. Those particles of soil are mostly made up of what we call inorganic or mineral matter. And that means sand, silt, clay, other things that have been derived originally from rocks and broken down. And then the last 5% is this organic material. And by organic, we mean things in a natural soil. It would be something like dead bugs or decomposing roots and leaves and things like that. So if you live somewhere where you might have had volcanic ash, or a place where there was a lot of flooding, or a really, really old area geologically, you're going to have much finer soils than you do like we have here in New England. New England was glaciated, so we have a lot of more particles and bigger pieces, rocks and stuff in our soil, just because it hasn't had enough time to break down and become small pieces like sand. So this is some garden soil that I dug up from the edge of my garden you can see how there's a lot of roots growing through it, and they're kind of coming through all of the different parts of the garden. They are going wherever they need to go to try to get nutrients for themselves out of the garden. Looking at your garden soil, you want to make sure you have good drainage, good aeration, a fair amount of mineral material that gives the roots something to grow into that helps to hold them up, and also some organic matter. Now, this organic matter holds a lot of nutrients. And why is that? Why does organic matter have more nutrients than a mineral soil? Well, if you think about, we are nutrients. We eat nutrients. When we die and decay, our body releases all those nutrients. When leaves fall in the autumn, they decompose and they release all their nutrients. So many different of the nutrients that plants need are stored in the organic matter. So you got your soil, it's nicely aerated, it's water's flowing through it really well. But let's talk a little bit about the nutrients in your soil. There's a really cool part about soil that I think is fascinating, and I hope you think so too. In the soil, you have clays and organic matter, and both of these create structures. Depending on what your mineral material is, if you have clay in your soil, clay is able to form different kinds of lattice structures in the soil, and when it does, it creates a negative charge on the surface of the soil. So no, you're not going to get electrocuted by your soil, right? So what that does is it helps to hold nutrients into the soil. If you look at what most of the nutrients are that plants need, they're all different types of what we call cations, which is positively charged ions. So since opposites attract, the negative soil holds on to the positive nutrients. Those nutrients would be things like potassium and some forms of nitrogen, calcium, magnesium. They're all positive ions, and that's how the soil holds on to the nutrients. Because here you are, you've made this nice aerated soil that drains really well. So what's going to happen? Are all your nutrients going to flush right through? If you decide to put on a liquid fertilizer, is that going to just drain right through? So this is where organic matter comes into play. Because not only does clay have these negative charges, so does the organic matter. I found this really nice illustration that shows how this negatively charged soil works. So you can see the gray part is clay humus complex, and humus is just another word for organic material, and how it has the negative charges on it. And this allows the different nutrients in the soil, like you see Ca++, that's calcium, sodium, hydrogen, magnesium. Those different cations are attracted to this negative charge. They're not bound up in some kind of permanent structure. They're just held gently onto the surface of the soil, and that allows them to stay there until the roots are ready for them and can take them up. It keeps them from washing out in heavy rainstorms. And so you can see just from this how important it is to make sure that you have enough organic matter in your soil. Because you may not have a lot of clay, and if you have too much clay, that can cause drainage problems as well. So organic material is the best thing to add to your soil for both nutrition and drainage. So you might be thinking, okay, great, I'll just throw in a whole bunch of compost into my soil and call it good to go. But I want to make sure that you're considering what exactly are you putting in, what kind of soil do you have to start with, and what do you need to add to your soil. So when you go to the garden center, you'll see all these different choices of different types of materials that you can put into your soil. Anything from seed starting mix to topsoil to mulch, and it can get very confusing. So what I'm going to do next is just go over a few of the different options that you can use, what they are, and what might be the best option for you. If you look around my garden, you will see that I've got all kinds of different types of materials here on the surface. I have chickens, and so when I clean out the chicken coop, I put my chicken shavings right on areas of the garden that I want to try to enrich. And over here, these are some of my chicken pens that I use for raising meat birds in the summer. I've got all my leaves that fell in the fall, and those are also being raked onto my garden to help bring different kinds of nutrients into my garden. Oh, sounds like somebody just laid an egg. So I want to talk to you about some of the different kinds of things that you could put into your garden to help to improve your soil. And the first thing I have, and not most of you probably won't have this, is some straw. It's like this kind of hay that's specialized for chicken coops. And so when I cleaned out my chicken coop, I just dumped it in a pile here in my garden. It does have chicken manure mixed in with it, so you have to be careful about not putting it onto any kind of very tender, brand new crops. I'm going to use this to mulch around my garlic probably when it gets a little bit bigger and is starting to need some more nourishment. And over here I have two different types of commercial compost that I got in a bag. This first one here is a lobster compost, because of course we are in New England. Gotta do something with all those lobster shells. So as you can see, this is like a really nice dark black material. It's got a lot of organic matter in it. And then the other one I have is this, which is just a composted cow manure. Now, I know it might seem silly to pay money for manure, but it is one of the best amendments that you can put into your soil. And one of the things you want to look at is the nutrient content of the different things that you get. So, for example, this stuff is made in Vermont. It's Moo Doo, I think is what it's called. And if you look here on the bag, it actually gives you a and look at the percentages of nutrients that are in there. So nitrogen, 0.5%, phosphate, 0.3%, and then potassium is 0.5%. And so sometimes you'll find different prices on things, and why is this one so much more expensive when it's basically the same thing? And so what you want to look for is, what is the percentage of nutrients in your different things that you're going to get? And then you can decide, which one is worth it, because you'll need to use less of something that has more nutrients. This again is my garden / forest soil. And you can look now, if we compare it, that looked pretty nice before, but now when I put it next to the compost, it looks much lighter in color, and you can really tell the difference, that there's a lot less organic matter in here. And what tends to happen is when the soil is moist, like this is, because I just dug it up, what you'll think, wow, that looks pretty good. But as the season goes on, you'll find that what you thought might have been a nice rich soil like this turns out not to be quite so full of nutrients after all. Here I've got some of my potting mix, and so I just wanted to throw this in because in potting mix is usually a combination of some kind of compost, some kind of aeration component, like this one has perlite in it. I tend to use vermiculite, and both of those are both good for keeping the soil loose and keeping it from getting compacted when it's inside of a pot when you're starting your seeds. And but I wouldn't use this in the garden. First of all, it's going to be more expensive, and you've already got things in your garden soil. You've already got that mineral material in your garden soil. You really don't need to add a lot of minerals. If you had a really heavy clay soil, you might, but what I recommend is that you kind of check with your local cooperative extension. They're a really good resource for finding out what are the soils in your area and what do you think you have, and even getting your soil tested if you feel like you need to do that. And last, I'm going to show you my own compost pile. It wasn't a nice neat pile, so I let the chickens out and scraped it all up. So you can see this is a compost that I was putting stuff in up until probably the middle of winter, when I just didn't feel like coming out here in the snow, and so maybe through last fall. And it still has a lot of eggshells, mostly sticks and things like that in it. If I was going to use this for a potting soil mix, I would want to screen it out first. In my garden, it's fine as it is, and I tend to just kind of rake it out and leave it and incorporate it into my garden beds as I need it. But one of the main things about homegrown, making your own compost is that if you have a large garden or even a small garden, the amount of compost that you can make for yourself is going to be very small. And that's why you have to consider going out and going to either your local garden center, which I prefer, or a lot of hardware stores will also carry bagged materials. So there's one more thing that I wanted to make sure I told you about when you are deciding what to buy to put into your garden. This is the front of that composted cow manure. And one thing that is really, really important, this is approved for organic farms. And do you have to get that? No, not necessarily. But what I really like about this particular product is they list right here, no sewage or municipal sludge. And you might think to yourself, what? Why in the world would that be in something that I would put in my garden? Well, you have to be very careful and make sure that what you're choosing does not contain sewage sludge. It is a common ingredient in a lot of the super cheap, topsoil or garden soil mixes. So if you're not sure, be sure to ask the people where you are, or again, go to a reputable garden center. They're probably not going to carry things like that. But if you decide to buy your soil at a grocery store, for example, where they have lots of their, when they have their plants out front, you need to be really careful. And they're not going to say that it has it, but they're only going to say if it doesn't have it. So if that's a concern for you, then make sure you check that out when you're going out to purchase your amendments. We've come to the end of this soil presentation, so I made a summary slide just to help you remember some of the things that we talked about. The first thing is that soil is a living ecosystem. It's home to roots, bugs, worms, and microscopic organisms, and I hope you'll look at soil a little bit differently now that you know more information about it. Second, ensuring your plants have enough nutrients requires a good quality soil. We talked about all the different components of a soil and how important those are. A good soil is well drained and well aerated, contains mineral material for structure and organic matter for nutrients. Organic matter, such as compost, is the most important type of material you can add to improve your soil quality. Next, be sure to read the labels and ask questions regarding the content of any soil blends or compost that you buy. Stay away from sludge for gardens where you're growing food. Sludge can be applied for sort of non-food land application. It's used a lot in forestry, but you really don't want that in a garden where you're going to be eating the food out of it. Again, going to a local garden center is going to give you more information. Contact your cooperative extension office or visit your local garden center to find out more about the soils in your area. So I hope this video was helpful for you. I hope that you are getting out into the garden in early spring and thinking about planting some things and going to your local garden center to get the information that you need and supporting your local small businesses as you do it. And thinking and dreaming of all those delicious vegetables that'll be coming out of your garden this summer. Bye-bye.
I think that is an excellent look at what is going on underneath your feet that we might not think about so often. So we do have a few great questions, and I'll just get started asking you those questions. A quick reminder, if you have a question, throw it in the Q&A and we'll get to it. So we'll start with these few that are here now, but go ahead and ask your questions and we'll spend the rest of our time getting answers from Alison. So Alison, one thing I want to start with is, how does the temperature play a role in soil health? Or how does it maybe change the quality of the soil at different times of year, like planting or harvesting or prepping?
Well, a lot of what happens in the soil happens thanks to the good critters and the microbiota A lot of people probably know about the microbiome in your gut. Well, there's something like that in soil as well. And a lot of the activity and the availability of the nutrients in soil can be dependent on that type of activity. So the warmer it is, the happier the bugs are going to be, the more they're going to be active. So that a lot of times as the soil warms up, then so do the other animals and microscopic organisms in the soil. And I'm not sure that's exactly what you were asking about, or whether you meant something more like, how does my zone, like my overall climate, affect my soil? So
yeah, I think that, so Maurice, if you want to add to that question, you can go ahead and do that. But I think one thing to consider is maybe, as you're saying, that maybe the temperature has less to do with soil health and more to do with the readiness of your soil for planting or other things. You'll see in a lot of planting tips that the guide or the directives will tell you to wait until the soil warms, right? So before you put stuff in it. And so checking your zone and making sure you know where you're at and how the temperature changes. And then also, I think if you can touch just slightly on composting and how and the effect of heat on composting, so that we can maybe carry over that into what it might do in the soil.
yeah, making your own compost. I mean, I'm one of those throw it out in the garden and see what it does kind of composters. This is why I did not get into composting specifically. Again, you know, a lot of the it's partly because I have chickens, so I feed most of my kitchen scraps to the chickens, and then I take the chicken, the things out of my chicken coop, and I put that in the soil. So, but if you don't have that and you want to do your own composting, one of the key things, there's two key things about composting, is that you have to have enough amount of material so that it stays warm on the inside of the compost pile. That's what causes, again, it's all about the microbes. They are the ones that are doing the composting. They are the ones that are breaking down and decomposing your plants and your food scraps that you're putting out there. And then the second thing is, you know, there's a whole philosophy of how much green stuff and how much brown stuff and how you want to blend it and so on. So I think that there's going to be someone to do a composting, a talk on composting, I think later on in Slow Food Live. I know that that we were hoping to find someone to do that. So stay tuned.
Cool.
Hopefully you'll have some more details about that.
Perfect. Yes. And somebody, just to answer this question quickly, somebody's asking what the best items to compost and what should be avoided. And so as a general rule, I think plant matter, you want to compost and avoid meats and animal products in your home compost. That gets a little messy and dangerous.
Yeah, in a commercial compost facility, they control the temperature and it's hot, and they can compost. They have it all controlled to be able to compost all kinds of food products, including meats and even bones and stuff. They'll grind that up. But in a home compost, you're really going to want to stick just with plant material, and also things depending on where you live. Now, if you live somewhere relatively warm, or I saw there was some people here from Barbados, so you could probably put some citrus peels into your compost, but you're not going to be able to, that's not going to work so well in a farther northern climate. We just don't have the bugs that are going to decompose that. So it's going to be specific to your area as well.
Excellent. Thank you. So someone has asked, Carrie is asking, she has a garden at home and a plot in a community garden. The plot in the community garden feels fairly dense and heavy, and the plants in there are growing significantly slower than her plot at home. So do you have suggestions for raised beds and how to assess, I think this would apply to any bed, how to assess what the soil needs and what amendments would be good for aeration and adding the nutrients it needs?
Well, it sounds like maybe your area is really compacted. So if it's been used a lot, there's a big discussion in farming about what's called no-till agriculture. And so I don't ever rototill my garden. I tend to just add these organic materials on top and maybe scratch it in a little bit. But it may be in a community garden, if it's been going for a long time, that it's just the soil has been really highly used and you just need to give it some more nourishment. So in permaculture philosophy, if you look at the way leaves fall in the forest, all of the organic material is added to the top of the soil, and then it breaks down, and over time the nutrients flow down into the lower parts of the soil to the roots. So in permaculture, they would never till up the soil. And so, but you know, depending on what you have, farmers like to plow everything. But if you are having a really compacted soil, I would definitely just, again, the organic material is going to be really helpful no matter what.
Excellent, thank you. And I just want to make a quick note to Rodrigo that I'm going to end with your question about Alison's recommendations for books and literature for novice gardeners. So don't think that I forgot about you. The next question is commercial mulch harmful to soil? And maybe I'll add to that, what can we do to make a mulch that is really good for our soil in our particular place?
Well, this kind of comes back to what I was talking about before. It's just like in slow food, know your farmer. With mulch, know your source. So a lot of municipalities now, or in larger cities, you will have people that will collect home compost, and they're making compost and they're reselling it. And you just need to ask, what is in here? What are you putting into the compost that you're making? I'm assuming you're talking about compost. You said mulch. So if you mean something more like bark mulch, that's a different question. But something like bark mulch, like you saw in my garden, I had all those wood shavings on there. Now, wood shavings don't have, that's a whole another whole video, I think, about nitrogen, but those are not going to break down as fast. I actually use those to keep weeds from coming up in areas. So mulching is different than compost. So don't get the two confused. Something like bark mulch is not the same as a more of a decomposed cow manure or a official compost. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. And I love gardening, but I am by all means an amateur and not an expert. And I just make a pile of leaves when I rake them, and then I use my leaves as mulch most of the time for the same reason, to keep the weeds down. Is that a good technique? I figure the weeds are in my own yard and they're not going very far. I'm just going to put them on this bed, and if you won't have necessarily a need for commercial mulch if you're able to just pull some stuff from your own garden. Is that a good technique? Or?
Well, absolutely, because then you know exactly what it is that's going on to your garden. And the reason why this is more important, what we're talking about today, is that you're talking about growing food that you are going to eat. Now, if you had, shrubs or something like that, it's not really as important. But whatever you're putting into your garden, for a vegetable garden, or even if you're growing different kinds of herbs, anything you're going to be putting into your body, you want to make sure that you are putting very clean materials into your garden. And it just reminds me, years ago, I lived in this house and I moved in, and the woman was like, "Oh, I have this great garden." And I was thinking, awesome, we can garden together. And I walked out one day and she was spraying the garden with some kind of pesticide. And I thought, why would you do that? Like, you don't have to. You don't have to. So, keep it clean, and the food will be so much healthier for you.
Perfect. Thank you. Next question is it possible to have too much organic matter, like compost or manure, in your soil? And does it affect fruiting plants differently than things like herbs? So maybe plants that don't grow so close to the ground, does it have a different effect? Can we put different things in there?
Yeah, so one of the things about compost is it tends to have a lot of nitrogen. And the basic idea about these plant nutrients is that, if you can remember this saying, it's called shoots, fruits, and roots. So then you see a lot of times on, like I showed you on that the cow manure, it had nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So shoots, nitrogen. That means nitrogen helps to grow the leaves and the stems and the green parts of your plant, shoots, and the second one is fruits. So potassium tends to help with more creating flowers. So if what you're trying to eat is a flower, needs to flower, then such as tomatoes, for example, you want to make sure you have enough potassium or phosphorus. And then the last one is roots. So potassium is known for helping the plants to grow better root system. So if you're growing a big plant, you want to make sure it has a good root system so it can hold it up. So one of the things you have to be careful is if something's really rich, like a real raw type of manure. So what I was using was a composted cow manure. So that means it's been sitting for a year. And if you went to if you have a local farm, you want to make sure, and you can go and get manure for free. Great. There are a couple things you need to think about before you go out and get free manure, and one of them is that a lot of times it can have a lot of weed seeds in it, so you want to be careful of that. And composted, the whole commercial composting heats it up and kills off a lot of those weed seeds, so that when you're buying the composted manure, you're going to have a lot less weed seeds coming in. And the second thing is that fresh manure, as you can smell, it has a lot of urine in it, and it's got a lot of nitrogen. And that, I think the question was referring to, can it be too much for the plants? So yes, you can have too much nitrogen. It can be too strong. But if you do have a source of free manure, just bring it in and let it sit for a while before you use it. This is why most farmers you will see, they will apply manure to their fields in the fall, so that it has time over the winter to just kind of compost over the winter, and then their fields are ready to go in the springtime.
Perfect, thank you. One more question, well, a question about roots is that when we saw your roots in the soil, they were small roots that you said is good. It means that roots are getting places where they need to go. But do we need to remove those if we're planting something new in there? Will they interfere with new plants you're putting in the soil, or do you just kind of push them around and leave them there?
If you're planting, when you're preparing your soil beds, because I didn't really talk that much about preparing your soil bed, and let's say you go in, a lot of people may be starting a brand new garden, which means I have a bunch of grass in my yard and now I'm going to dig it up and try to plant a garden. In that case, you are really going to want to try to remove a lot of the roots and the plants that are already there before you try to put any garden plants in. Otherwise, it's just going to get so weedy that it's going to end up crowding out the plants that you want to grow. So yes, I would definitely remove any kind of roots or weeds before you plant. Uh-oh.
Sorry, this mute thing gets me.
I was like,
I'm like, I'm just talking to myself. When are worm castings useful? And you answered a question a little bit about citrus, but would you apply that? These are two questions in one. Would you apply the same rules to onion, or can we throw the onions in with our food scraps too? And maybe you can talk a little bit about worm castings and what that means, which is a different thing than a bag of compost or compost you're making from food scraps.
Yeah, the worm castings basically means like worm poop. So it's just, and what happens is that worms are, they're not actually native to the United States or to North America. They were brought over with colonization, but they are very, very good at taking big pieces of material such as leaves and eating them, and then basically pooping it out the other end, and then that is basically composting it for you through their digestive systems. So that's what the worm castings is. So it's just a really nice, well-processed type of organic material. I have some worm castings that I bought in a bag, and they're great, but I use them more like a fertilizer. I wouldn't use them as a general compost for my whole soil. I don't think you could afford to. I think it was like $10 for a small bag of it. So it's excellent stuff. It's just probably not financially feasible to put worm castings in your entire soil. As far as the onions, yeah, onions are great. Those will break down, and I was referring, with the citrus, I was referring to, this is an article that I read one time that was talking about how certain things are appropriate for your compost depending on where you live and what type of microbes you have in your soil that are going to be available to actually break it down. For example, coffee grounds is something that a lot of people put in their compost, which I do too. And it's mostly because I don't want to feed it to my chickens. But should you put your actual paper from your coffee filter, should you put that into your compost pile? I mean, it will break down eventually. It just depends on how quickly you want compost. Again, turning your compost, making sure you have enough of, you can actually kind of seed your compost with some existing compost that you might buy, and that gives you some bugs to kind of like inoculating it. What's the word I'm thinking of? Like kombucha, where you put in your SCOBY and you get, or with sourdough, where you use a little bit of previous sourdough to make a new starter, that sort of thing. So that's one way if you want to kind of jumpstart your compost pile.
Perfect. And can you mention a couple cover crops that improve soil structure and increase biomass, and maybe give us a brief description of what a cover crop is and why we use them?
Yeah, so a cover crop is also sometimes called a green manure, and it is a type of plant that you would put in. It's usually some kind of more grain type of a plant. A lot of the common ones that are used would be oats, winter rye is one, clover or alfalfa, any of those. So what those are used for would be in, say, in a farming situation that you're growing corn. Corn takes up a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So farmers will not plant corn in the same field every single year, or their soil would get depleted of all these nutrients. So on those years where they're not planting, they put in what's called a cover crop. And what this does is it just is something nourishing for the soil. And in the end, they would just till it underneath, till it into the soil, and take that material that is the plant material from the actual plant itself and kind of grind that up and just sort of compost it, grind it right into the top of the soil. If you have a really small garden, you could, in the fall, when you were done, it would be awesome to put in some rye, or I think rye is the one that they tend to plant in the fall, and let it grow. Here's the trick. You have to till it in before it goes to seed. There's a certain point where you grow it for long enough, and then you don't want to keep growing it, because then you'll just end up with a crop and the seeds all going to seed and things like that. So it can be really useful. Whether you need to do that in a small garden, you probably don't need to.
Great, thank you. Someone is mentioning an effective addition to deep beds called bokashi, and asking if you're familiar and what do you think of that system. She's on an island where a lot of farmers are using Korean natural farming techniques. I think she has even mentioned herself that this might be a different topic or a different session perhaps on IMO and EMO mixtures, which I'm not familiar with. So maybe just effective addition. If you have any comments on bokashi or effective additions to very deep beds?
Well, I have to say I am not familiar with that at all, but it sounds really interesting, and I'm going to Google it after we get off of this webinar. So if you have a really deep bed, that is awesome, because that means you have a lot of soil and a lot of room for your roots to grow down. Again, I am not trained in permaculture, but I work a lot with permaculturists in this area. There's a really great group here. And that's one of the main things I learned from them, is that in a natural system, the organic matter wants to land on top and work its way down. So I tend to not really dig up my beds and so on. But it sounds like this might be more of an artificial system that's being created. So in that case, even in a raised bed, or I saw earlier someone had something about growing in pots. And so if you're going to be growing in pots or in a raised bed or some kind of more artificial system where you're not really using the soil, where you, the underlying soil at all, then you definitely want to get a good mix. And I know earlier in Slow Food Live, Cynthia had talked about a type of a soil mix that she had put into her raised beds, and she did something on that. So you can maybe go back into the archives and find some more information about that. But again, some sort of potting mix or I have my own kind of blends that I use as well, if you're using some kind of artificial system like that. I hope that helped answer that question, and I kind of went off on another subject.
No, that's great. That's great. So because you're mentioning pots, I'll ask this question, which is, Linda is in a city apartment and has some compost and basic soil from a hardware store with seeds. And how can she best prep those pots with what she has to introduce the seeds into them? And asking, does she need to research each specific seed and plant differently, or can she kind of come up with a mix that works for all of them? And Linda, as far as putting the whole little bag of seeds in one medium-sized pot, I would say just pay attention to the planting directions on the back of your packet, which will tell you how far away they want to be from each other. So the question to you, Alison, is how to prepare soil for pots if we don't have a bed to work with.
Right. So in that case, you don't have any, like I was just saying, you don't really have any soil that you're starting with. So you're not going to want to use a straight compost, because a good soil is a blend of mineral material, which is more like this, sands or other kinds of small particles like that, or vermiculite, which is it's actually a type of clay, and compost. But your best bet's going to be, it sounds like, Linda, that you got a pre-made mix from the hardware store. So in that case, if it says potting soil, then it's going to be good to go just how it is. And one of the things with working with pots is that watering is very tricky. So depending on the kind of pot you have, a lot of people like to use a decorative clay pot. Those dry out a lot faster than a plastic pot. So if you're gardening in pots, make sure that you have a good quality soil, again, so that it holds the moisture, but also just keep an eye. You'll kind of get used to it, and you'll figure out how often it needs to be watered. Regarding all the different seeds that you got in a seed packet, there's always way more seeds than you need usually for a home garden. So just be careful how much you plant. You don't want to overdo it or feel comfortable. You'll need to feel comfortable thinning out the seeds after they start to sprout, so you don't overcrowd your plants.
Perfect. And actually last week's garden session was on growing cool weather plants, but Lily gave some really helpful information on thinning your plants. So maybe look to that session for a little help with your starts, especially if you're doing it in pots and not directly in the ground, on how to finish. It's got a good little scissor technique. Thank you, Alison. The next question is, how often should I have a soil test done, or should I send out a soil test? Do you do that with any regularity, or do you just do it as a response to an issue?
I would suggest that if you, like, say you moved into a new house and you really didn't know anything about how the soil had been used there, you might want to get a soil test done. But here's the reality about soil. You can go, if you're going to collect soil for a test, you've got to take about 10 different small samples and mix them all together to get an average for your soil. Soil is very variable, so it's going to be different in all different parts of your yard, let's say. So you could get a soil test done. I don't usually do that because I usually add enough compost so that I know I have a decent amount of nutrients in my soil. And I also I use like a fish fertilizer on a lot of my plants, and so it's kind of up to you. If you're a beginning gardener and that's going to make you feel better to go, okay, I know I'm starting with something good, or ooh, maybe you're really low in certain types of nutrients. What I would say is probably the most important thing to test, and you can just go to the hardware store and get a little test strip, is I would test the pH of your soil. This is how acid the soil is. And in depending on where you live, some soils will be, most soils are more acid than, well, it really depends. It's going to be incredibly variable depending on where you live. So I would test that, because most garden plants like a pH, which stands for, it's actually the measure of how much hydrogen is in your soil. That's what pH is. But, you know, lemon juice is super acid, and bleach is on the opposite end of the scale. So somewhere right towards neutral is what most plants like for their soil. And you can just basically take a sample of soil and put some water into it, take a little pH test strip and just kind of dunk it down in there, just to get a general idea of what your pH of your soil is. Because if you have a really low pH, you're going to want to add some lime. If you have a really high pH, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember what you add. We don't have high pHs around here. Ours are all acid, so I don't remember what you add in for. But again, go to your garden center or cooperative extension and get that information about, well, what is my underlying soil here? And then you'll know kind of where your starting point is and what you should expect.
Perfect. And you briefly mentioned that extension. So a lot of universities and states have an extension service. I live in Oregon, and the OSU extension service is amazing. And just like Alison is saying, they're able to answer questions that are really specific to where I am. And like Alison knows that the pH level of her soil, and they might be able to give you somewhere to start with. So someone has asked how to know what our soil is missing without testing the soil. And I think that might be a good starting point, is maybe do the research and make that phone call and ask what the soil tends to be in your area, and then see if you can find any similarities. And then it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, that little pH test, without having to send off a soil sample and do all that, that little pH test might be a good place to start to find out what your soil is missing. And I'm going to go back to a question on tilling or not tilling. Do you use the no-till method for everything, or are there some things you want to till for and some things you don't, or do you till every few years and not? What's your sort of approach to whether you till or not?
Well, part of the reason why I never rototill my garden is because I have a lot of herbs that self-seed, and I do a lot of wild harvest of different, even dandelions and things like that. So I don't let, my husband always says, we got to till up the garden. And I'm like, oh, no, you're going to till up all my friends out there. You are not allowed to till the garden. That's part of the reason why I don't till, is just because I want to see what is coming back from seed before I till things up. Things like kale, you can let stay out in your garden, and that will go to seed. And you can get like a kale patch going so that you don't ever have to plant it, and so forth. The no-till method officially is really something more oriented towards farmers. And the idea behind it has a lot to do with, number one, keeping the organic matter in your soil. And number two, preventing erosion. So when crops are harvested in the fall, all the roots, say from your corn, you cut down the corn stalks, you leave the roots in there, and that holds the soil in place so you don't get erosion over the winter. And as we've been talking about for this whole hour, there is so much great, once you make a nice soil, you don't want it to be washing away. It's so important. So it is a very valuable asset for either a gardener or a farmer.
Perfect. And I'll just ask a couple more questions. One is, and this is interesting because it's still snowing for some of you out there. Carolyn has a wood stove and lots of ash, and how can she add that to her garden, or should she add it to compost, or what's the thing to do with that? Is that beneficial for the soil?
Yes, wood ash is very beneficial for the soil. When we were talking earlier about the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, wood ash tends to have a lot of potassium in it. So it is considered a good soil amendment. You definitely want to, you can put it into your compost. You could just kind of sprinkle it around the soil. I have a wood stove, and I asked my son to take the ashes out to the garden, and he dumped it in a big pile. I did not get my kids trained well enough for gardening, I guess. But so it can raise the pH. this is the thing I was thinking, it can raise the pH up. So you want to be mindful of where you're going to put it in your garden. Tomatoes, which everybody loves to grow, tend to like a more acid soil. So you probably don't want to put your wood ash where you're thinking of planting your tomatoes. If you incorporate it into a compost pile, then that is a great way to just kind of spread it out and keep it kind of blended in, and you don't end up with patches of too much wood ash in one area, because it's not that easy to spread evenly, that's for sure.
Perfect. I just want to mention that a couple of you are asking about your new raised bed or just a new bed. And our very first garden session was kind of on starting seeds, and one of our educators touched on low tunnels, and she had a raised bed, and another just made a new bed in her garden. So check out that session because we just have 2 minutes left here, and hopefully that'll answer your question. And I'll end with Rodrigo's question on what literature do you suggest for a novice gardener if somebody's just getting started. And I mean, this is amazing. If there's nothing in your soil yet, this is a great place to start. Do you have a couple favorite books or anything that you can point people to for getting started on gardening? And I can also ask you this in an email, because we'll follow up with all of you with a link to the recorded session. So unless you can grab something from behind you, Allison, we'll put that in an email and we'll send that to all of you so you can reference those books. I know that personally my books are pretty tailored to my area, which I have found really helpful. So I don't know if you have a couple you want to throw out there, we'll just send that in the email.
Well, the only thing I'll say is what you just said. I would find someone who's growing in your area and see what they're doing, because they're going to really, like around here, we have Elliot Coleman, who did a lot of work up in Maine, and a lot of, 4-season growing in cold areas and things like that. And then the other thing I would say is to check out some of the, just the online resources, such as, I have been kind of a hardcore organic gardener for a long time. And so I like the Rodale Institute. I like Mother Earth News. Those are just kind of online magazines and websites and I can, like you said, Giselle, I'll send you some of my other favorites.
Thank you so much for this. We really appreciate you lending your time and energy to this session. We've got a lot of people in here, which is really exciting. I'm so glad you guys are so interested in this topic, and we'll send that email and let you know how to get in touch, and check out the upcoming garden sessions on Thursdays, and we'll just kind of get into each piece of gardening with our awesome network of garden experts. So thank you so much, Allison, for being with us today, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much to Slow Food for providing. I love how you just went like, all right, we got to do something. I know, let's start a Slow Food Live. And I think it's really awesome that Slow Food USA has taken this on and is providing this to everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you, everybody.
It's folks like you that make it all possible. So thanks for that, and happy gardening, everyone. Take care.